Hello, everyone who is joining us right now. Hi, welcome to the worlds of the Word Child universe. I am here with our guest of honor, Kaarin Lowachee. So I'm Marina Berlin. I'm gonna spend a minute or two just telling you about this event while people log on. And we're very happy to have you here with us. We're going to be talking about Kaarin Lowachee's work and her books. And just to clear things up, this is going to be an interview. I'm going to ask Kaarin questions. Some of you have suggested questions in advance. And there's not going to be a Q&A portion at the end, but there is going to be a Q&A event at 9 where you are welcome to come. And all we're going to do is ask Kaarin your questions. So definitely bring that over there. Okay, so I'm Marina Berlin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author and media critic. And this is Kaarin Lowachee, who is here with me. And she's gonna talk a little bit about her work. You've probably read her 2 books that were translated to Hebrew, War Child and Burn Dive. Kaarin, tell us about your work.
Hi, everybody. I can't see you, but I'm imagining hordes of people that came out just to see me. Yeah, I'm here in Toronto. It's snowy outside right now. And yeah, I'm a writer. Obviously, I write novels, short stories, a little bit of poetry, some articles as well. I do film review for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I have 4 novels. So as Marina said, 2 being translated into Hebrew. I don't know what happened to the 3rd one. I wish it had been. But the 3rd one is around, and that's in the science fiction series. And I just recently put out a kind of like a collection of stories that takes place in the universe. So if you like the universe and the characters, this kind of anthology in the War Child universe is from different characters' points of view and through different timelines, and even exceeds the timeline of the books by a little bit. I'm currently working on the kind of the soft 4th book of it. It'll turn out probably be a short novel, like short for me, because most of my novels are 300 to 400 pages or more. So this one's turning out to be a little short, but it takes place pretty much right after the 3rd novel, and I'm almost done that, and I'm excited to get that edited. It'll probably need some editing and to get that out early next year, hopefully in the 1st quarter. I'm also working on a collection of just my short stories that have been published in the last 20 years or so, 16 years, as there's been quite a few, and a lot of my readers have asked where they can find them, because not all of them are online. I think only a handful of them are online. So I decided to put together a collection of those 2, because I really like the short stories. Are a different thing for me. I get to kind of stretch different muscles that I don't necessarily get to do in novels. But I write science fiction, fantasy, a little bit of horror. I love all the genres, to be honest. I don't really see and think of things in forms in terms of genre. So I just write whatever the story turns out to be. So that's me. And I'm happy to be here.
Yay. Okay, we're going to talk about all the stuff you mentioned. I'm going to start from a fairly basic question that I think you've been probably asked many times, but a lot of people who've read your books in Israel may have never heard you answer. So for everyone who's read War Child, some of the most often repeated questions are, how and why did you decide to start writing War Child in 2nd person?
To be honest, like it wasn't a formal literary decision, I should say. This sounds so kind of hippy dippy, but I literally woke up one morning and the first line of the novel was in my head. Like until that point, I'd been actually writing it from the basic idea of it from a different point of view, was actually from Eric's.
Wow.
Eric was a completely different type of character. And I thought I was going to tell the story about a jet aboard Macedon, who Macedon came across this kid who ends up being a spy. And then I realized, you know, through the R&D of the book, is that the better story is from the spy's point of view. That's his experience, who turned out to be Joss. His experience was more in keeping with what I really wanted to say with the book. And even before that, it actually was a completely different, I mean, the evolution of how ideas happen. It's funny, I had the world, I had Nico was actually one of the first characters like ever in the universe that I thought
Wow.
of. I knew his name, and I even have my notes still from that period where I just jotted his name and stuff. And I knew who he was right from the start. And it was actually going to be, I ended up kind of telling the story in Burn Die, but the original, very, very original character was a diplomat's daughter. But then I decided when Joss kind of came onto the scene that I didn't want to tell the story from anyone in a privileged position, so to speak. Like, I didn't want to tell the story from a general's point of view, or a captain, or someone that's near to those types of people who kind of orchestrate wars. I wanted to tell it from a child's point of view who really has no idea what's going on. And this was back in like 1990. I'm aging myself. I was quite young, I should say, when I was developing this, but this is back in like the late 90s. Mid to late 90s is when I was developing the idea. And so once I landed on Joss being the actual protagonist, I don't know, I guess the unconscious works. I'll be running a class at Clarion next year that's about, you know, accessing the unconscious in your writing, but because I believe very strongly in it, that even though I might not have been actively working on the story like pen and paper, but your unconscious is working all the time. And so I think it was working, you know, in my sleep. So I woke up literally and had that first line. I remember so distinctly that from that first line, the whole first 40 pages came from it, like pretty much in one shot. As soon as I just kind of had that scene in my head of this kid in a maintenance tunnel, in a maintenance grate, behind a maintenance grate, and his experience of his ship being boarded and him being young and not really understanding what's going on, it propelled it. And I always knew it would end once he was on board Falcon's ship, that it would switch to the first person. So at that point, it was intentional. But the voice of it was completely natural to me and to the character. And I knew that it fit completely. And from that point on, the book didn't write itself, but it felt right. I knew that the voice felt right. I always knew Joss's voice, whether it was being authentic or not in the scenes. And I think it was the first 40 pages of the book that kind of lynched that for me. Like, I just knew him. So yeah, not a thought out thing. That's why it's important to follow those instincts as a writer, and not second guess yourself just because. I mean, it wasn't until after it was published and I was being interviewed that people would be like, you know, that point of view is really hard, or it's unusual, or whatever. But me and my ignorance, you know, was just like, that was just the most natural point of view. So, and I didn't think twice about it. And I guess I'm lucky that, you know, the contest that it won, that the editors that were, and Tim Powers, who was the judge, was like, at least, you know, they liked it. So it worked out. But yes, long answer short.
I feel like second person now is a little more popular. Like, there's one of Anne Leckie's latest books has a huge section of it that's second person. Tamsin Moyer's like Hair of the Ninth is almost all in second person. But when you were writing it, it was kind of groundbreaking, especially in genre. So I'm just wondering, were you concerned at all, whether you yourself or the editors or anyone in the process, that it would kind of alienate readers who were, you know, opening the book for the first time, that it would be like too weird or anything like that?
The editors didn't say anything about it. Honestly, they actually they liked it, obviously. Like, they felt that it propelled. Nobody ever asked me to change it, I should say.
Oh, wow.
So and I've had a few, like, it was Tim Powers, and then Betsy Mitchell, and then eventually my editor, Jamie Levine, and none of them in that process ever asked me to change it. They asked me to change other things, you know, justifiably, the editors did. But for that one thing, no. So, and I didn't worry about it. Like, I feel if you believe in the work and you know why you did it, like it's not just a trick. You know, I don't do things for tricks. It has to serve the story. Everything I do stylistically, to me anyway, it serves the story and the narrative in general. And if it doesn't appeal to everyone, then that's taste. I don't wring my hands about that, to be honest, because I'm not going to appeal to everybody. Obviously, I mean, you like, obviously not everybody loves the book, and you can't expect everybody to love your work. I mean, that's a unrealistic expectation. To me, it's just, as long as I write honestly, from an honest place, then I assume at least that some people will pick up on it and respond to it. And that's kind of proved true anyway, from the feedback that I've gotten from readers. And that's all I'm concerned with, you know, really. And I don't do things, you know, just to shock or just to do something trendy or anything. It's not, I don't operate. I never have operated that way, even before I was published. You know, so.
Okay, so I'm going to take this into a different direction, because you talked about the R&D of the book. I wonder what sort of research, if at all, did you do for the book that had, you know, nothing to do necessarily with characters, or I don't know, or just the world or their experiences or anything like that?
Well, I always kind of maintain that, you know, as a writer, I think it's a good comparison is if you're an actor. I think the two things, to me anyway, from what I've seen, kind of work the same, in that you are a sponge, you know, in your life. You everything that you read, everything you experience, the people that you talk to, the people you might overhear, you know, on a busy street or a bus, like you're a sponge. You always have your ears and your eyes and your senses, you know, your senses open. And your mind open to things. And so the research, of course, there's pointed research in the sense that, yeah, when I was writing the military sections, I'd always been interested in the military anyway. Let me just say, like, kind of to a caveat is, I put everything that I was interested in at that point in my life in my first novel, because I think George Lucas said this about Star Wars. It's like, he did everything because he didn't know if he would get another one. You know, you don't know if anybody's going to be interested. Right? So why hold back? So I've been interested in the military pretty much my whole adolescence onwards. I was constantly reading biographies and memoirs since I was in high school. And I think all of that prepped me. You know what I mean? It wasn't intentional. It's like, it wasn't until I was writing Lwacha I realized, yeah, I want to write kind of like a memoir of a kid. And, you know, keep in mind, this was the late 1990s. Around 2000, and there actually at the time, because I remember distinctly, there wasn't a lot of talk on the world stage about child soldiers at that point, because I remember distinctly that when that started, the talk on the world stage about child soldiers, I was, you know, happy that it was finally getting that kind of attention, because I had been doing research and, you know, learning about what was going on in the world with regards to that, and weren't seeing a lot of it on the news, weren't seeing it, a lot of it in newspapers, you know, no exposés, no memoirs from these kids. And now there are lots of that, which is great. It's kind of like people are aware now, hopefully. So my research was kind of like ongoing. I was prepped for it my whole life. And then I always loved martial arts. You know, I took martial arts when I was a kid very briefly, but I always was really into it. I love Japanese culture. One of my best friends growing up was Japanese, and so she kind of was my gateway into Japanese culture. And so all of those things, which I think was one of the other questions, is what influenced alien culture, Asian culture in general, because that's part of my heritage, and just because I'm interested in it. But it wasn't like super direct, but it was there, because I wanted a warrior culture anyway, right? So all of those things kind of went into it. And then as I was writing the story, then you do more pointed. Like once I got on the section that when he was on the space carrier, when he was on Macedon, I did very pointed research of what carrier life is like, what's on an aircraft, those super carriers, you know? And I was lucky that I have a friend who's in the military, very much in the military, and actually did work with carrier crews and special ops crews and all this kind of stuff. And he kind of vetted some of the stuff. The funny story about that is I met him through the Del Rey online workshop. I don't know if anyone in the audience remembers that, but that's when I first started writing War Child, was for this workshop, and I was getting feedback from people who are my friends to this day. And he was one of them, my friend, Steve, and we ended up meeting at a convention in Toronto after the fact. And he told me that he thought that I had served or had done martial arts or something because of the stuff that he was doing, which is the biggest compliment, because he's actually lived that life. And but he's so kind and was read my work, subsequently. Burn Dive, the bodyguard stuff, and so that's when the research becomes very pointed and specific in those kinds of instances. I wanted to get the terminology right. I wanted to get the kind of the culture right and all of that, the subculture of it right, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, did that answer the question?
It definitely answers the question. Okay. I'm also curious, you said that sort of Asian cultures were the inspiration for, Nico's culture, for the alien culture. I wonder, language plays such a huge part of War Child. I remember when I was reading War Child, that was maybe one of my favorite parts of the book, how realistic it was in portraying kind of language acquisition and the confusion of it and so on, especially for someone who was still growing up. And I wonder how that aspect of things was for you. Like, did you base it on something real? Did you, how did you approach it?
Well, I took French growing up. Like, in Canada, it's practically mandatory. But I did continue, studying French all through high school when I didn't have to. And I drew on that experience, to be honest, like what it was like trying to learn another language, what the rules might be grammatically. And I figured that out. Like I like basic things. I'm no tall guy, so I'm not a linguist. So I wasn't, building it where you can, write, translate Striverknot to Shakespeare. It's not to that extent, but I made some rules in my head and I wrote them down of basic construction and the letter groups and what they would sound like, and try to embed it in the culture of the Striverknot as well, because language is so tied to culture. So if they had certain phrases that would translate to majority, which is Joss's language, it's English or it's Hebrew or it's whatever language people are reading it in, but that the certain way of speaking would be tied to their culture in some way. So one of the first things actually was that they don't lilt up when they ask a question, right? So that was one of the first things that Joss noted, and so he didn't, his cues are that if he's being asked a question, there would be a rise up at the end of the sentence. And because he didn't hear that, so it made Nico sound very stern, I guess, is that, because everything felt like a statement. But they indicate question by other things, by hand gestures, and with the aliens themselves, by the way their wings flutter and things like that. So, and I tried to, because to me, in my head, they've evolved from more of an avian type species, that the sound of the language, because I describe it as sing-song, and so I try to mimic that in the transliteration, I guess, of what the language would be, and in that way. And so they have silent T's that are silent to human ears anyway. So certain very specific rules I created for that, and then try to be consistent. And I guess you could see it most in the assassin crew's terminology, is that it's very, to me, it makes sense. Like the first master, second master, and then that kind of pattern is repeated in the moves, or in certain concepts in the martial arts, which aren't just kind of like, in martial arts, it's not just like your hand and leg movements and things like that. There's a philosophy behind the way they term things, and so I wanted to mimic that as well. That it's not always just a kind of like a literal translation. So yeah, I was conscious of it that way, and some of it was from my own language study, because I had some of these practical experience in trying to learn another language, and how difficult it is to become fluent.
Okay. Okay, so taking it into yet another related but slightly different direction. So many of your characters, not just the protagonists of the books, but also side characters like Cairo, like Evan, come from enormous amounts of trauma that really kind of colors their lives and affects, you know, who they are and how they behave. And in general, the way that you write trauma feels so visceral and so, I don't know whether to say realistic, but definitely very immersive emotionally. And I was just wondering, what about it draws you, and like, why do you think, you know, you chose to write so many characters who come from that particular place? What about it is something that you love dealing with?
I think more than making a conscious choice to write about trauma, I'd made the choice to write about war. So you can't really have one without the other, to be honest, and that it's in various degrees, obviously, depending on the person and their experience. So like someone like Eric, right, doesn't seem that he has any trauma, right? Because he comes off a certain way and it's very authentic. But, you know, in building a character like that, I knew very specifically the things that he'd been through. But it's just that he as a personality handles it much different. And in a way, that's kind of the thesis of the whole series, because it's a mosaic series is what I call it. So it's from different points of view. And I had that idea from the start, because Joss's experience is different from Ryan's, which is different from Yuri's. And all of them are different from the captains, or different from Evan's. And that's solely because of who they are as people. That there's no one size fits all when it comes to extreme experiences like that. And I did want to look at war in a microscopic way, in that, you know, very internal way, as opposed to, again, in general, space opera is all about the big political movements and things like that's going on. And I didn't want to, you know, I think in Burn Dive it went closest to that, just because he was, you know, was the son of a captain, so but he was, you know, estranged, and his experience was completely different. Ryan's, he grew up privileged. But to me, that was what was important, because I read a lot of memoirs and letters and stuff from soldiers growing up. That's what I was interested in, was hearing things from their point of view. Not the history books necessarily, but the letters and the memoirs from the men and women who actually served in all through history too, from Civil War all the way through to the Iraq War, the Gulf War at the time, and that's what I was interested in. So so to me, I treated all the characters as individuals. I mean, it's as simple as that. It wasn't me trying to insert anything into that. It was me coming from a place of, this is who this person is, and this is their personality and their experience growing up, and the family that they come from, or the family that they don't come from, and how do they handle their specific situation, and how do they come out of it. So, and how do they internalize that? And so that's what was important to me in writing a series that kind of focuses on war and all of the ramifications of war. Some of it are very obvious, and then some of them are not as obvious.
Okay. So Joss and Yuri, you mentioned this, they can really be classified as people who are very far away from privilege in their lives, at least at the start of their stories. And they both are, I don't know, they're kind of similar and very different from Ryan. And it's really interesting to me that Ryan, who's the protagonist of Burn Dive, that you went from Joss to Ryan. Just because they're so different. I remember reading Burn Dive, I remember being so impressed with the point of view of Joss in War Child. It felt so immersive and so amazing how it changed as he got older. And then Ryan was this utterly amazing thing that was completely different, like absolutely complete opposite direction. And from what you said, also opposite direction, because Ryan is a lot more privileged. And it is kind of a different story and a different vibe. So I'm just wondering, how did you go from, you know, Joss, which you said he kind of came to you and you kind of, you know, you kind of subconsciously maybe knew what the beginning of the book would be and so on. How was that process with Ryan? And how did you decide to go from someone like Joss to someone like Ryan?
I might be retroactively creating my own history, but I think from what I remember that by the time I was finished War Child, I knew the next two books. Like I knew the points of view that I wanted to tell for the next two. Well, I definitely knew Ryan, you know, very early on because I knew that he existed. Obviously, he's mentioned in War Child that Joss sees at least the picture of Ryan when he was a teenager on the captain's desk, and that was a specific call out in the sense because I knew Ryan's history at that point. I knew exactly, you know, what I wanted to do with him. And so I wanted that kind of indication that the captain had a family that obviously wasn't with him. And so it was saying something about Cairo, and it was also saying something potentially that was, you know, going to happen, that Ryan became kind of a parallel point of view. And that once his story was told, even he sees it in the book, that he thinks that Joss is kind of like a substitute son for his father, which he doesn't, you know, he has strange emotions about. He's not supposed to care, but he does. But I wanted those parallels in there, but not to hit you over the head with it. And so I knew, yes, early on that I wanted to tell Ryan's story because I wanted to show in some way that just because someone isn't kind of overtly thrown into the worst situation ever, that they can still be affected, and to challenge the reader about their own judgments too. And judging from some of the feedback I've gotten over the years, it's like some people judge him quite harshly, like they can't stand him because he's a brat. And I was like, well, if you were 17 and this was your situation, how do you think you'd handle it? You know, I mean, that's the mindset that I put myself in, is that he's a teenager. He's kind of been set aside his whole life. Sure, he's been privileged in that he hasn't wanted for anything physical, except maybe affection. but that his life being what it is still not ideal. And then add on top of that, when things happen that he had no relation to. So what happened when he was on Earth and there was a terrorist attack, and from someone who has never experienced something like that, that would obviously be the most traumatic thing that you witness, you know. And so to me, like, I wanted to treat him again, like I said, as his own person. And I wasn't trying to shoehorn, you know, extra stuff. I was so in his point of view. I write from a very psychological standpoint, which might be obvious. So to me, when I was in Ryan's head, I was trying to see everything through his experiences, his point of view, all the bad and all of his misjudgments, to all of his attitude, why he was reacting in a certain way. All of that was brewing and was in my head in some way. And I think it has to be, because I didn't want to be cheap about it, right? I'm very conscious of not wanting to be cheap with these characters, in the sense that I don't want to just, and maybe it doesn't translate to some people, but I never do things just for the sake of doing them in the narrative. To me, they grow organically from the characters' experiences, and the plot and the character inform each other. So I'm not just going to throw plot things in the character just to make it interesting. And at the same time, I'm not going to just put traits and characteristics onto the character in order to make them interesting. To me, I wanted to confront the reader a bit with, okay, it's easy to get on board with a kid like Joss, right? Because he's completely innocent and these horrible things happen, and a lot of it's out of his control, and he doesn't gain any kind of autonomy until right at the end. So, but with Ryan, I wanted to challenge that, to say, well, you have no reason to feel compassion from a kid like this, but can you? And then how does he grow as well? It might not be in leaps and bounds, but how does he, through his experiences, actually gain a different perspective? And it's all about perspectives, I guess. All of those books, an underlying theme, for want of a better word, is different perspectives on sometimes the same events. And so his perspective of his father as opposed to everybody else's, his perspective on the war as opposed to everybody else's. It's ignorant, like his father says quite a lot of the time, but aren't we all? Most, you know, I mean, because I'm conscious of the fact of where I live. It's privileged to a certain extent. I've never had to live through a war or live even adjacent to one. I just live next to the United States. But we, that's when I see these things on TV, and if something was to happen in proximity to me, what would be the reaction? And does that make it any less impactful just because I didn't grow up with it? It's still, those things still affect people, regardless of where you're at, and as they should, I guess, because there are horrible experiences. And how would he handle it, and how would he reconcile with that? And I wanted him to be kind of that point of view, the point of view of someone who is doesn't grow up with that. He's just adjacent to it, or he witnesses it until he's actually in it, and then that changes his perspective. He grows more compassionate as a person, too, and all of that. But yeah, that was my angle with him.
I think another big difference between Ryan's point of view and Joss's is the humor. Joss is kind of almost allergic to humor, where like everyone around Joss has that sense of humor, but Joss has a lot of trouble with it, whereas Ryan is just nonstop, like most inappropriate jokes, like etc., and like is always the center of it. Was it? Were you after Joss? Were you like, I'm dying to write some humor, so this is going in this book? Or
no, not purposely. No, that just came out of Ryan being a snarky little shit. Like he's, that's his defense mechanism. But also because he did kind of grow up in a different way. He doesn't, he's trained himself not to take something seriously, or he tells himself anyway, right? So he will use humor, and also because he liked going to parties and having fun and all those things that Joss, didn't experience as an adolescent, obviously. Joss has humor. Joss's humor is just dark and very deadpan, whereas Ryan's is kind of like provoking. Ryan's humor is very provocative, and it's really to amuse himself more than anything. So, and I knew that he would engage with people differently, obviously, right? Like he thinks he can take on Eric, like, he's a little clueless, but it's because it's pride, right? He even acknowledges that, I think, in the book, that he knows he has too much pride. And so that's where his sensibility comes from. And he's provocative, and because he wants to get some sort of kind of engagement, meaningful engagement from the people around him, rather than just being set into boxes and stuff like that. So he provokes his mom, he provokes Sid, he definitely provokes his father. A typical teenage, like, I won't do anything, I won't, be respectful of authority type of thing. He's got that privilege too, right? Like he recognizes right off the bat, like he's a media darling. So that was very conscious for me, is that he grew up in the media with a mother who is involved in the media. So he knew very much how to read people and how to engage with people and get what he wants. And, I loved writing the interactions between him and his father, because he knows that he can get away with stuff that everybody else in the whole galaxy cannot get away with his father, just because he's his son, and he played on that. And I loved doing that. I loved testing Cairo that way, and then knowing that what Cairo was like when he was his age too, and having that at the back of my mind and having that kind of play out. So that was a lot of fun. Ryan was fun to write, and he got on people's nerves, but hey, teenagers sometimes do, right? Sometimes. I love teenagers, but yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to ask about, this is my cheat question, which is the question that's dearest to my heart, because Evan is I won't say he's my favorite character because it's so hard to pick, but I definitely have a very, very special place for him in my heart, because Evan kind of has the kind of significant trauma that like Joss has, or Yuri has, or Ryan as well, but Ryan's story is just a little bit different. But Evan's trauma is so profound on the one hand, and on the other hand, he handles it so differently than kind of everyone else. And because he's a side character, we don't ever really get his perspective. We kind of get bits and pieces. And I think his story, the thing that struck me the most was how not camera ready, if that makes sense, his story was. His story wasn't neat or kind of easy to digest. So I'm just wondering what went into writing a character like Evan, whether he needed to serve some kind of purpose in the narrative for you, or was it just like, you know, an idea for a character and that's what you went with? Or
funny thing about him is my editors initially wanted me to kill him off. So I know, and I think I initially thought I would kill him off, to be honest. But I realized, luckily, in writing it and then in doing the edits, that he is Joss's one link to who Joss was before everything happened, and he's that one reminder, and he knows it, right? And Joss is his one reminder too, and so their relationship is one of like home, really. They recognize that what they had before this horrible thing that happened to them was they were each other's home, and that link is really important, even though Joss won't acknowledge it. Joss won't acknowledge it, and Evan can barely look at it, but to me that was important, and actually kind of it'll play out, you know, hopefully when I, you know, write more in it. That link that they have to their past was important. And so I remember actually very distinctly writing the first scene where Joss realizes who it is in Macedon's brig, that they scooped up, you know, the pirates from Shiva, and this person kind of confronts him, and that it changes Joss's world, right? Because he, in that moment, he's both kind of simultaneously that kid again, but at 8 years old and growing up, and he has all of these memories of Evan and Evan's brother, and that was his tribe, you know, on the ship. Their families were close and all of that, but then seeing what Evan is his reflection too, that this is, he can see the changes in Evan, obviously, and that then reflects, he knows that he himself has changed. And that's a hard thing to confront. So it was kind of like all of those things mixed in. And so, but Evan's a survivor too. But he did handle it differently, obviously. And actually he was aboard, he was with the pirates longer than Joss ever was. Like Joss was there for like a year, which is bad enough. But Evan was there for more years in the thick of it. And he was the Shiva captain's protege to boot. So I think after, you know, hopefully people have gotten to read Cage Bird, it's like you can kind of see what that process would have been like. And actually he shows up in Cage Bird very briefly. Yuri, who's the Falcone protege, meets Evan very briefly. And so you can kind of get an idea of what he went through, and yet he still held on to, and I think it's his, he never forgot where he came from either. You know, Yuri kind of did. So that was the difference too, and that I wanted to show is that they're all different, even though they've had similar experiences. Even the captain too, right? Is that Evan never really forgot, you know, who he was ultimately. He adapted, but he never really forgot, and his insistence in wanting to still be in Joss's life is part of that. Like he recognizes that this is, even though he's, you know, he has his own issues of accepting certain things, and but I think ultimately, because he's older than Joss as well, so he understands that this is, you know, they've got to a certain extent of what's left of what they were and what their families were and what their ship was and all of that. So I'm glad that I didn't, you know, my editors didn't press about wanting to, you know, killing him off. Like what function they made me question, if anything, like what exact function did he serve? Is he needed in the narrative? And then I realized that, yeah, I think he is needed for as another facet of Joss's story, like an important facet. I love that, you know, different readers that I've met and have talked to had kind of adhere to different characters, and I'm always curious as to why certain ones above others. Like I have another reader who loves Rick, who's like even more of a side character. He's like a literal just walk on like twice in the whole series. You get a little bit more of him in the collection, in the universe collection, but he's literally just in 2 scenes in the novels, and I have another reader who like really loves him. So I love hearing that. I find it really interesting who people adhere to. But yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. Do you plan on writing more? Is Evan going to be in more sort of material in your head right now, or is his role kind of done for you?
He'll always be there as long as Joss is there, and but his role on Macedon is very different than a lot of the other characters, right? Like he's not a jet, and he's not the captain. The captain, being a really good assessor of people, knows that he cannot put Evan in any kind of combat function. So his role is always going to kind of, he's close to Ryan now too. I remember how that organically came together. I said, who are the 2 characters that can really like, or who's the one character that can really just be horrible for Ryan? And it turned out it was Evan, and that seemed quite natural. So, and that Joss is kind of in the middle of that, and very suspicious of that relationship. But yeah, he's always going to be there in different, I think, because Joss needs, certainly in The War Boy, which is the 5th book, which is the one that I'm about 50 or so pages, 50 or 100 pages into that. And that is again from Joss's point of view. I didn't think that yeah, you didn't know that?
Oh my goodness, we're getting more Joss POV. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't think that I would write one from his point of view, but actually, once I developed Matryoshka, which is the 4th, the kind of the short novel that's bridging, Matryoshka will bridge Cagebird and the War Boy. So everything that happens in Matryoshka like bears directly on what happens in the War Boy, and they pretty much pick up one after another. So yeah, he's definitely going to be more in that because Joss is the point of view character, and that is going to kind of stretch what's happening, like the fallout of what happened in Cagebird, and then certainly the fallout kind of politically what happens in Matryoshka, which you'll see. And yeah, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's on my Patreon. I've written a few chapters of that, and I've plotted that out. So yeah, that he'll be in that for sure because Joss is. So yeah.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. So I just want to ask you, you mentioned that you have a Patreon, right? So if you can tell people where they can find, the short story collection, and in general, on your website or on Patreon or on Twitter, or where can people find more stuff related to this universe?
Well, I don't have a website right now. That's under development. I'm kind of revamping it, but I have Twitter, which is, everything is /Karen Low, KRINLOW, just to make it consistent. So the Patreon is too. I'm not very consistent with the Patreon because it depends on what other projects I have ongoing. But yeah, the Patreon, I've been writing Matryoshka, and I was writing the War Boy on that, but I realized that I couldn't write them simultaneously. I had to figure out the logistics of the one book before the other because it bears on it. So I put a pause on the War Boy as I'm finishing Matryoshka, and everything could be found on Amazon. And I also have a Goodreads page and all of that. But basically, yeah, Twitter and Amazon, and then my Patreon.
Okay. Okay, I think we have less than 2 minutes left. So I just want to say thank you, Corinne. And I want to say anyone who's watching us and has questions, at 9, we're going to have another event with Corinne, and we're going to ask her questions, just questions from the audience. So please come and send me all of your questions in chat, and I will ask Corinne for you.
Yes, please.
And thank you. And as a last comment, please, everyone, note the amazing sci-fi mirror behind Corinne, which I think is like very appropriate background for this event. And I want to thank Barak and Mayan, our support staff for this event. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who came and listened to us. And thank you for, thank you for loving Corinne's books as much as I do, so that we could have her as a guest of honor.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, Corinne. It's been really, really, really amazing. And I will see you, Corinne, and also all of you watching this in about an hour. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to wait for the technical team to tell us what to do now so that we, because I'm not sure. Yes, no, we are waiting for people to tell us whether we're supposed to.
You done?
There we go. Okay.
And we are off air. Thank you.
Yay!
Okay.
Thank you so much.
That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much. That was fun. I know I rambled a bit, but I tend to.
No, it's super fun. That's what people come for. They want to hear you talk about stuff. Like.
Oh, well, I'm glad. That was a lot of fun. It went perfectly smooth thanks to all this tech team behind here. So yeah, thank you so much. And I guess I'll go and my cat is sleeping. No cat cameo, but maybe in an hour or so she'll wake up and wander over. But yeah, that was so much fun. Great questions, and I'm looking forward to I didn't realize that you were an Evan fan, but that's fun. There's a point of view. He's in the Omake. So
yeah. I haven't read it yet, but I already have Omake, obviously. Anyway, do we need to like vacate the premises or anything? I'm asking Mayan and Barak because I know there's a logistics thing. Like, do you need us to log off or something? Like
yeah, there's an event. The people of the event after you are not here yet, but they should be any minute. So it'd be good to wrap it up. I want to thank you guys because it was super interesting. I was listening the entire time and it was really cool.
Thank you.
And I also put a link to your Patreon in the chat so that people listening could have that as a link. So you could ask whoever is going to be producing the 9 o'clock one to do the same if you're mentioning it there.
Okay, cool. And do you have anything to pass? If you have anything to pass on to me, my email or anything like that.
No questions. They were really good about saving their questions for 9.
Yay.
Great. I hope everyone enjoyed themselves. So I'll be back in 45 or 15 minutes before the next one.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
In an hour for me. Okay. Thank you so much, guys. Can't wait. See ya.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
היי.
היי שלום.
היא כתבה משהו שאני מכירה?
ילד מלחמה? אז לא, כנראה שלא.
סיוון, נראה לי שכתבת בהצלחה. תעברי לשקופית של לפני אירוע רק שאני אראה שזה יציב.
רוני, את הוסט.
אני יודעת.
לא, עשיתי אותך הוסט.
מעולה, סיוון.
כן, זה זורק לי התראה כזה. סבבה, והנה דמיין.
רוני, את רוצה אוכל?
כן, בבקשה.
אוקיי.
בנימה זו.
אני שומעת את הדיליי. ביי.
ביי, תהנו.
Hello, should we be listening to this? היי.
שלום.
מה קורה, דמיין?
בסדר, מה שלומכם?
בסדר. שנייה לפני שאתם עושים את מה שאתם עושים, פשוט יש לי קצת זנבות מהאירוע הקודם. דמיין, האם אתה צריך את רוני כצופה ומגיבה באירוע שלך?
ענבר, אני חושב תהיה פה, אז כאילו רוני, את מוזמנת להישאר אם את רוצה, אבל אני אתמודד.
מה שנוח לך, אם זה יעזור בכיף, אם לא, אני אהיה בלי.
אוקיי. כי אם לא, אז אני צריכה בבקשה שתעשה share screen, כדי שאני אסדר מחדש משהו שעשיתי קודם.
את צריכה שאני אצא מווידאו, נכון?
כן, בבקשה. אחלה, תודה רבה.
טוב, דמיין, אתה מכיר איך זה עובד? אתה צריך שנסביר לך?
אני מקווה שיהיה בסדר.
לא סתם, אני עושה את הסבב הקבוע, אבל אני חושבת שאתה מכיר את זה קצת.
עשיתי את זה, בוא נגיד, לעשות את זה פעם אחת, זה לא מספיק כדי להכיר את זה, ומספיק כדי לשנוא את זה. איך הכנס שלכם?
משעשע, אני ורוני באותו זום, כי אנחנו באותה דירה ואסור לנו לקרות.
כן, כן, this is a very shitty time for everything.
כן, זה תיאור מדויק.
טוב.
אני לא יודעת.
אני לחסוך התנתקויות לאחר כך, אני נשאר על הזום, אבל אני לא עושה כלום באירוע הזה, אז תתעלמו ממני. יש פה סיוון ורוני.
אוקיי, ברק, רציתי להגיד לך שקודם הקרנתי אירוע שהייתה בו מצגת שהיא הייתה 3/4, ואז חשבתי מה ברק היה עושה, ושיניתי את הפריים.
שינית את הפריים, רגע, מה עשית?
כדי שלא יראו את השוליים בשחור שהוא slightly different.
אז עשית קרופ בשביל שיהיה שחור של הזה? כל הכבוד, אני ממש מרוצה. לגמרי בפינת very satisfying.
את לא יודעת את זה, אבל שומעים את החיוך של ברק דרך הדלת מהחדר השני.
אוקיי, אז דמיין, אז כשאני מדברת, אז רק אתה שומע אותי ולא הקהל שומע אותי, אז כשאני אתן לך 10 דקות, 5 דקות, אתה יכול להתעלם ממני לחלוטין, אף אחד לא שומע. אני אעשה לך 10-9 כשיגיע הזמן, ב-5 אני מאפילה את הוידאו, ב-3 אני מאפילה את הסאונד, ואז אני שם את עצמי על מיוט, אלא אם כן תהיה לנו תקלה טכנית, ואז מוציאה לשקופית, אומרת לך, מחזירה, וזהו, that's pretty much me, ואני עכשיו אהיה על מיוט עד שנגיע לשאר יהודה.
2 שאלות קטנות, האם אתה רוצה את השאלות בטקסט או מוקראות? את השאלות מהקהל?
אני אקח שאלות אם בכלל בסוף. אז כאילו...
אז אתה תרצה שאני אקריא לך אותם בסוף?
כן, כן, תקריא לי אותם.
אחלה. אז גם מבחינתי זה הכל תכלס. אז זהו, אז יש עוד 10 דקות בערך, ואז אנחנו נתחיל.
טוב, אבל. אני משאיר את הסקרין שלנו, סיוון, כדי לא לשגע אותך.
כן, תשאיר, אם אתה קם, פשוט תשאיר את המצלמה, הכל as is.
סבבה.
ואני אוהבת את התמונת רקע שלך, אני מתחברת אליה, ואני רוצה אותה כקעקוע או פוסטר, או אני לא מצליחה לבחור.
תודה. אז אני הולך שנייה 5 דקות לפרוק סופר.
תביא את אולי בינתיים.
לא כי יעבה לכם חברה.
אוקיי.
יקי, אתה רוצה לעבוד חברה לאנשים?
אני מנצל את המדיום בשביל לעדכן את רוני שהזמנו 2 ראשונות של פיתות, אבל קיבלנו רק אחת, אז זה יצטרך להסתבר.
אני משוכנע לחלוטין שהחתום פשוט יקפוץ למעלה ויתחיל. בסדר. לא, תודה. אני אזרוק לעצמי מים עוד. כן, אתם מוזמנים לפה.
אוקיי, דמיין, יש לנו בערך דקה.
סבבה.
ואני לא יודעת מה עם בראה שם מאחורה, אבל שומעים הכל. אז שתדעו.
בראה, אז אני סוגר את הדלת, בסדר? את מצטרפת תתורי? יותר טוב?
הרבה יותר טוב.
אני בטוחה שזה יעזור, זה פשוט שמור גירות נפתחות ונסגרות או משהו כזה.
כן. אוקיי.
אוקיי, ואני בטוחה שיהיה סופר נהדר, וזאת ליטרלי ההרצאה שביקשתי להקרין.
תודה רבה.
very pleased ו-very excited. ואני חושבת שאנחנו יכולים לעלות לשידור, אז האם אתה מוכן?
זה שיש חתול שמנסה לפרוץ את הדלת. כן, אני מוכן. יאללה.
אוקיי, יאללה. אז 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ואתה בשידור.